Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I recognize some people, former co-workers and family and friends out to support. Thanks for being here. It's really good to see everybody. I'm not the best at monitoring the chat while I'm presenting. So if you feel you have a question, you want to stop me anytime, just jump in, turn on your mic and speak up, please. I really appreciate that. So we're going to get right into it. The beginning, just so you know, the beginning will be a little bit of participatory, and then I'll get a little more explanatory as we go. So even if you're not in a place where you want to show your face, could you turn your camera on and point it to the ceiling or somewhere else where there's, I promise I'm not looking in your house. If you could see behind me, you'd see a 2-year-old's tornado. So, and then we'll get to turn them off again in a second. So if you could do me that favor, I'd really appreciate it, because I'm going to ask you, just to get an idea of who we have in the room, to turn your camera off if you're a current administrator in a school, and then leave it off once you turn it off. Okay. Please turn your camera off if you are a current teacher in a school. You can leave it off. Okay. Please turn it off if you work in a school. Great. Turn it off if you are a retired teacher or administrator. Okay. If you work as a consultant or for an education company. Okay. And then if you're a family member or a friend here to support. So if your camera's still on, Christine, what do you do?
I'm a district administrator. I don't know if that current.
Okay, good. Good to know.
I'm sorry.
All right, thanks for sharing. You can turn your camera off now. Ty, what do you do? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks for that. I misunderstood. So I'm a current teacher, so I should be off.
Yeah, turn it off, thanks. And then I see my dad. You can turn your camera off too. Thanks for being here, Dad. Okay, so while your camera's off, hopefully you came prepared with a piece of paper and something to write with. I'd like you to think back to the last time you learned something new. So think back to the last time you learned something new. All right? And it can be something simple. What was the process? What process did you go through when you learned that something new? Okay, and then what were the steps you took? So I'm going to ask you to draw it. Now I'm going to show you. I didn't mean, it's hard to see, but I'll just keep flashing in front so it can show. But I just have like a little stick man with some squiggly lines and stuff like that. So if you can just draw quickly what that process looked like, what the steps you took. I'll give you a minute or so, and then I'll know you're done when you turn your camera back on. When we got enough cameras back on, we'll move on. So my process was I learned how to do a podcast, or how to upload a podcast. And I've drawn out my steps. We'll give you about 30 more seconds. It doesn't have to be elaborate. All right, Ty's got his drawing done. Good, thanks. Kadla, hi again. Just going to turn off my background it was on for kids. I should be able to share mine with you now as well. Okay, so if you're not a gifted artist, like I'm not a gifted artist, you probably have something squiggly liney and circle, so I don't want anyone to feel bad. The important part is you're thinking about the learning process. All right. Very good. So as I'll know you're done as you turn your cameras back on, and then I'll just introduce myself real quick as the last one's finished. Ashley was so nice to introduce me, and you probably read my bio, but I just, quickly, I'm Jonathan Chenier. I've been in international education. This is my 20th school year. It's hard to believe it goes by so fast. And I have a passion for experiential and personalized learning. Most of my jobs that I've had I've been able to really get out in the field with kids or be focused on experiential, whether it be as an athletic director, activities director, teacher, coach. There's been a lot of different approaches to it. And as I've moved on in my career, I'm really, really passionate about getting to know more about personalized learning and what a process can look like for that. And finally, I'm a little naive. If you've worked with me before, maybe you know, I tend to believe people right away. And I think that's good in a lot of senses. Maybe not when someone's trying to sell me a car that doesn't exist, but when I'm thinking about, hey, yeah, I met this lady who's the daughter of an owner of a school in Mexico, and a week later I'm working at that school in Mexico, and I was in British Columbia at the time. Or, hey, why not go to Venezuela during a tough time in their history, but a great time for me to learn and grow as an educator. So there's just different things. My naivete has pulled me into situations that have helped me grow. They don't always turned out to be the greatest thing in the world, but the learning has been awesome. So what I'm going to do right now is put you guys in a breakout room, and I'm just going to ask you to do something briefly. Welcome back, everybody. If you could just take 1 minute to explain your learning process. So you'll hold up your picture and just
now the risk in a virtual conference
when you do breakout rooms is those who might not take enjoy 2 minutes that to discuss will disappear on you. But thanks for sticking with us. I really appreciate it. I hope you had some fun chatting about your learning. What was it about the learning? We'll just briefly the process itself that was pick on the volunteers who are going to share how different their learning experience and activities were, the qualities they had in common, the details. And finally, just their process. Pick one person to share their picture and the commonalities. Room 5 was Christine. Your room is I didn't write everybody up. It's Christine,
yep, that's
Gabriela,
fine.
and Thomas.
Yeah, I was voluntold to lead it. So
great, thanks.
Anyway, mine in particular was bread making. So first, I had this desire to learn how to do bread making. Second, my husband gave me a class to do bread making for Christmas. Then I took the class hands-on, getting your fingers wet, but also our teacher taught some theory about it as well. And I have practiced it over the last 2 years, and so we only eat my bread. And then as we looked at our themes among us, we first had interest. We all were willing to jump in and just start doing. We then practiced. We also had the will to kind of continue on, and then we practiced some more. That was kind of our process and steps.
Great. Okay. Since there's so many of us, I won't dig in too much, but I'm going to ask you guys to keep this in your mind and see if you recognize any of these things as we move forward. Okay. Thanks, Thomas, for sharing. I really appreciate it. Group 4, I see Rocio was in there. Who else, or who's the volunteer from room 4?
Yeah, that was my group. We didn't get a full-on chance to designate, so I'll just go ahead and go for it. Similar to Thomas, my experience was bread baking, and the curiosity was the element that led me to it. And what we found as a group is that we shared pretty much 2 common characteristics: is that we had a genuine curiosity to try something. Other examples were baking lasagna, meditating, and then curiosity about essential oils. And then our persistence, despite all of our uncertainty, is another common characteristic that we had.
Great. And I was meant to say it with Thomas, but it's clear that bread making was one of the winners of 2020 with all the not so happy stuff that went on. All right, Dawn was the name I wrote down from group 3, but who, just so I had a person to, who would like to share from group 3?
Well, basically it's just looking at following someone. I need to see, and then I need to do and have someone supervise me doing it. And then I need to do it by myself to feel that I've got it. And that was like making a flip grid, for example. Great,
thanks.
It's been a challenge online, but it does work. The person on the other side can walk me through it too.
Very good, thank you. So following, do, watch them do, and then do myself. Very good. Okay, group 2, what was the process? I see Angie was the name I wrote down, but was there a volunteer from there?
That was me.
Okay.
So my example was playing the piano. Mine wasn't curiosity, more so that my middle school kids kind of convinced me to be part of the talent show. So for our commonalities, it was using resources like YouTube or Google. So finding that outsourced resource to help us, continuing that kind of practice in a loop of like repeating, making mistakes, and then continuing that loop, and then with the trying multiple times.
Great. So would we all agree, thanks Michelle for that, and it's great to see you again. There's a spark. We all agree that everybody had sort of a spark or an interest or something that pulled you in, right? And then you started looking for resources, how to do it. What I kind of, I think was implied, but I just want to check, did anyone feel like there wasn't some sort of feedback cycle? You know, did you taste the bread the first time and it was terrible? That happens to me every time. And then you feel you had to go back and keep trying.
Oh yeah.
Great. And then Michelle, did you play piano before?
I did, and hadn't played for a while, but you know, quarantine.
Because if the kids came to me and asked me to play piano in a recital, I'd be pretty terrified, but I'd give it a shot. It might not be fun for people's ears, but okay. I'm going to jump back into
team one.
Was sorry,
team one, because team one I don't think presented.
Team one is I think that was a team that people started bailing on us a little bit, not super interested. But is there someone from team one here that wants to share? I just noticed it got down to one or two people, and I thought I'd spare them in case.
Great. Sorry about that. Sorry.
But if someone would like to share, please do. I wasn't sure if they were still here.
It was me and your. So, but we share about what we learned last. What was our last learn thing, and I was talking about taking some courses in YouTube because I just self-motivated to do something different during pandemics. And your father was talking about learning Spanish. So we got a nice chat about self-motivation and try, making mistakes and learn from that.
Great. So notice how I paired my father with a Spanish teacher that I've worked with in the past. Very good. Thanks for that. And thanks again for being here, both of you. Appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to bring back the screen and just walk you through what we're doing at our school a little bit. And again, I'm going to let you know that as I present, it's a little tough for me to kind of see faces and the chat. So if you want to stop me and ask for Claire, don't feel bad. Just turn on the mic and say, hey, whatever you need to say, okay? I appreciate it if you do that. All right. So about a year ago, we finished up Live Curious. I was fortunate enough to lead an experiential learning activity on our high ropes course that was in the background of the background photo behind me when we first started the session. And that was actually from Live Curious, I believe. And it was just a fantastic time. And we were all together and we were out in the open air. It was a little cold, but and then everything that happened in 2020 happened. So we were forced to go to distance learning, like many of you. And as a result, I feel like our school was quite fortunate in that we had done a lot of blended learning training. We had the platforms, our kids have access. But the transition still, from one day to the next, we basically told the kids Thursday, school was out. Friday, we brought the teachers in to do a little kind of mini training and planning. And then Monday we were distance learning. And a lot of our teachers were trying to do what they did in person online, just like a lot of teachers at every other school. And at the end, we noticed that, some kids just weren't engaging or making quality academic progress. It just wasn't working for them. But then there were some kids who really surprised us that all of a sudden they were popping, and we take a closer look and we see, maybe they've got some certain set of skills outside of the specific academic skills we're looking for that allowed them to work in a positive way independently. Then when we asked the kids, what did they feel like they needed most when we finished that kind of school year from March to June? And they expressed a few needs. They weren't always sure what they were supposed to do. They didn't feel like they could get the same feedback they could get when the teacher was in the room right in front of them. And, how do I organize myself in this way if I'm not in the physical learning space? So we had all of that information and a summer to think about it. So our driving question became this, what you're looking at. But as we moved on, we have Will Richardson in our mind, Ewan McIntosh. I don't know if you've been able to interact with him in in this seminar, we had all these people saying, why should it be the same? How can it be different? How can we improve? How can we change the way we go about doing things? And at the same time in our school, we've been looking for the right approach to a more personalized learning experience where kids could take on agency. So we updated our question a little bit. It wasn't just about distance learning. It's about learning, the learning experience in general. So all of you shared learning experiences that you had. And if I'm not mistaken, you probably all shared one that you enjoyed and that you chose to do yourself, right? Now, if I think back to my teacher training and a lot of us who are pre-millennials and maybe some millennials as well, we got a lot of this kind of teacher-led training. You know, you plan in this way, the teacher sets the goal, the teacher pushes them to share prior knowledge, the teacher, you know, tells them what new information they're going to receive. And that's kind of been the way I was trained and the way I carried myself when I was full-time in the classroom. So what we're going to look at today is a more personalized approach. So as our school, we know that it doesn't just happen from one second to the next. And especially in a school, I'm working in a school of 2,400 plus students. So it's hard to just shift mindsets and culture and everything overnight. In smaller school, it might be a little easier, but I've worked in smaller schools too, where it's tough. You know, change is something. So what we're thinking about is what's our continuum from the more teacher-led approach to a co-constructed and learner-centered approach. So we turn to, I put in you all have access to these slides through the Live Curious website, but we looked at different resources, and one really good one that talked to us about the continuum of learning was from a school district in Wisconsin. So we just updated it to fit our language and vocabulary and culture a little more. But the first thing we're looking at when we move from teacher-led, which is still okay, we want to start and make sure we're all solid in teacher-led, but getting more comfortable with releasing that responsibility to students gradually, and then move towards co-constructed and learner-centered. And if we do it in one classroom, you might not get much further than teacher-led, because every semester or every year you get a new set of students. But if we can do it in every classroom and kids are more and more used to this, that will be helpful. That will help us advance kind of our to a more learner-centered or learner-led experience for kids. So first we have to look at dispositions. Now I'm not going to read all of this to you. You can see it, you have access to this slide, but really it's driven by grades to more inspired by the learning process. And beyond dispositions, we want kids to have a voice. So what does a voice look like as we're working our way through the continuum? You know, teachers, we're a standards-based school, so the learning's always going to go through the standards. But we want the standards that we pick, the essential standards that we pick, to be the minimum and let the kids go beyond them and find their way beyond them. But we want to get everybody to that minimum because that's what we committed to as a standards-based school. But as we move towards a more learner-led model, which we're hoping to get, we're not hoping, we're going to get to, okay? That's our goal, that's what we're moving towards. The learners become more and more adept at looking at standards, looking at enduring understandings, or creating their own enduring understandings, creating their own learning criteria. And then choice. I mean, early on, choice is important. Teachers can prepare lots of options, but later on, the choice becomes more them making choices about their learning based on the learning objectives they set for themselves. Pace is another thing. You know, as you'll see, as I start really sharing the specifics of our model, it's tough on teachers to have kids in different places at different times. And if you have a class of 23, you might have 23 different kids in 23 different places. And that's enough to make my hair fall out all over again, you know, until you get used to it. You need a culture that's within the school. You need an understanding of what the learning experience is, and we'll get there. We'll get there. And you can look at examples like Iowa Big or High Tech High and different places where they've gotten there. So this year, as we're just getting started, I've been teaching a leadership class in middle school, 7th, 8th grade mix for the last couple of years. And this is kind of how it looks like. Last year I actually started trying to go right to student-led, and it fell apart on me. I knew I needed to scaffold my way there. So we got to a point where, you know, most of the kids are teacher-led. Some are ready for co-constructed, and others are ready to kind of build their own learning experience because they have a better understanding of the standards and how they learn. And as we go on, we just want to start shifting more kids along the continuum. And by year 5, 6, 7, maybe we have a lot more. But some kids might be student-led in math class, but need more hand-holding and be teacher-led in socials or social studies. So it's also a possibility as we work through a continuum. The kids are in different places in different classes. So now with all that in mind, enter learning loops. At ASFM, middle school and high school, we developed learning loops as a framework for our learning experience for kids. It doesn't just take into account the academic standards or the academic learning that needs to happen. We know that to release responsibility to kids, we have to consider those social emotional aspects, habits of mind, the affective, you know, whatever you may call it in your environment. And they're all a little bit different, no? But by aligning this, we go back to what the kids were asking for. They were asking for some clarity. They were asking for clear communication. They were asking for expectations to be laid out. So one way to kind of remove a lot of the noise around us is to have this common wayfinding. Now, if we think about, so before we even look at the specific steps, if kids get into every class and the map, the wayfinding, the path they take is the same in each class, it makes it a little easier. So one part of it is we are kind of an understanding of design school. We do backwards design. The teacher still identifies those big ideas, those enduring understandings. At the end, there has to be an acceptable measure. So we prefer to move away from kind of traditional tests and be more project-based, more performance tasks, those types of things. But we have to be clear on what's an acceptable kind of presentation of your learning evidence. And then more and more, we want to be releasing that learning plan to the kids to help determine and design. And again, another, you know, I mentioned wayfinding just a second ago, but basically what wayfinding is, and I'll show a kind of a visual example in a second, but is the student knowing the answer to these 3 questions. They don't necessarily have all the learning there. They can't factor quadratics yet. They can't speak a new language yet, but they know where they're going. They know where they are now, and they know what they need to do next. And that's what we want to make sure. So if they can get into every classroom and have at least that in mind, that's a great place to start. So examples of wayfinding might be in an airport terminal. You see on the screen that you need to go to A4, but you have no idea where A4 is. You look at the map. When you go to a mall, it's a big mall, you've never been there before. You can wander around for a long time before you find where you're going, or you can go to the map. And a GPS is just another example of that. So our wayfinding icons look like this. Essentially, kids know whether they know it or not, they experience a launch. We don't always just label it launch because we want to leave that wonder, we want to leave that surprise. And then they work their way through the learning loop and the different steps. And as they finish, and we'll see how the learning loops can be stacked on the top of each other in a second, it ends with a unit assessment. But when they go to their learning management system, we use PowerSchool Unified Classroom, but it could be Google Classroom as well. It could be, they see these icons and they know what they mean. And that saves a lot of time. That removes a lot of that kind of noise in the background. So a few more icons here. And our loops specifically, let's see, now I want you to think back to your own learning experiences. So you drew your pictures and maybe look down at your picture and think of your commonalities. There was, it's not pictured here, but there was some sort of launch, some sort of spark, some sort of draw of attention that made you wonder, hey, could I do that? Or I'd like to do that. Then you engaged in it somehow, right? So if we're talking about the bread example, maybe you took a class or you watched a YouTube video. And from there, you had an objective. I'm going to learn how to make bread. And you maybe broke it down into more steps. I'm going to learn the best ingredients. And then you had to make some decisions about what you're going to do next. Now this part, the do, we'll talk about in a second, we'll go into. We find that at first, we found that decide and do kind of went together. You decided, just go do it. But we're finding more and more, this is where that social, emotional, habits of mind, executive functions live. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I won't go in a deep dive in it, but realizing that that is almost as important, especially for kids who already have some prior knowledge. They might not know how to organize it or present it. So all of a sudden, you've got to be helping them and coaching them on things that don't have to do specifically with your academic skills you're measuring, but they're skills they need to get to where they need to go. Then we talked about reflection. How was it? Self-assessment. Did the bread taste any good? Maybe not at first, right? Can people understand me when I speak Spanish? I'm working on my pronunciation, right? So there's feedback, there's reflection and feedback. And then I make a plan. Do I keep going to the next one, or do I re-engage in some other parts? So we'll go a bit deeper into these. But I just, this is what it looks like. Now, one loop for a smaller learning objective makes sense, but some of our standards, some of you may have NGSS in science in your schools, or some of the heftier kind of key or power standards you might have from Common Core. They need to be chunked down, broken down into smaller chunks. So we use the term, people might use success criteria, benchmarks. We use the term learning objective. So we have our unit, our whole unit might be made up of as few as 1 or 2 loops and as many as they need. Okay, and what we do is we have our launch, and then kids work their way through the loops, the smaller chunks, and they come out ready for success on whatever the unit assessment is, the performance task or whatever it might be. And some kids might be ready to jump ahead right away, and we'll talk about that in a second too. So first is our unit launch. And this is where, if we were doing a mini learning loop right now, my launch was to ask you to think about your learning experience. But in science class, they might show some sort of phenomenon, like something lights up on fire or burning of steel wool, and see what happens. And you just have the kids watch and get it and really kind of get hooked into it, maybe asking lots of questions, developing that or reaching for that kind of inquiry lens. And so what a launch looks like is that, an entry event. But within that entry event, as we go through it, the kids need to know where they're going. So what's the enduring understanding of the unit? What are the essential questions? What are the standards or criteria? You may either have prior data that tells you where they're at, or want to do some sort of diagnostic assessment or event to see where they're at, to know how to support them through and allow them to be clear on where they need to go next. So for a leadership class that I teach, we did a mini unit. I did a mini loop, just one loop, just as practice, and asked them to watch a video on online learning habits, and then see and read this quickly to get them kind of knowing we are about to go into another year of distance learning. Now we know a little bit more about what it is, and they're going to start to develop their goals around what kind of online learner I'm going to be. So this is just one example of what I used in a small example, but they can be everything from this to like an elaborate field trip. Then the engage part. The engage part is where you make, we're going to talk mostly about the teacher-led version of this, because before we can get to co-constructed and learner-centered or learner-led, we need to be solid in this teacher-led piece. And then, but start removing ourselves more and more from the process and being more facilitators, coaches, and hands-off, to let the kids go through it, set their own goals, try, make mistakes. It's okay to fail on your way to success. So they'll see a learning objective, then set a personal goal. So if we're just thinking about the objective from the graphic I showed a little earlier about the different dispositions necessary to be a successful online learner in an online learning environment, this is our learning objective. So you might have one about, and now this comes from a larger standard. You might want kids to factor polynomials, but you have to break down the pieces of that. So the learning objective would be a smaller piece of that. And then this is actually an example a student in my class wrote. So for this, I mean, it's the first time they wrote a goal with me. It's tied to the learning objective. We'll work on writing clearer and clearer goals as we go. But for now, this was practice and it was a good start. So then it's time to decide. Now, early on, again, we're talking about gradual release of responsibility for kids and working their way to making their own choices. So there are many different things we could do. So these were the different verbs we came up with. And we felt like anything a teacher could ask a student to do or a kid could decide to do on their own fell under one of those categories. So in this first one, same deal. It's the same example. We selected activities for them. So it's decide, but at first, until they're ready, the teacher can decide. The teacher doesn't stop making decisions. The teacher can decide what some students need to do, especially if it's a complicated skill in math or science or English or whatever. And so you'll make sure they attend lessons when they're needed to. There has to be new learning in some places. So for this one, it was just a simple little loop. They had to watch the video. They had to read the graphic. They had to complete documentation. Now we had a unit called Growth, Grit, and Gratitude coming up. So they already had their journal and we had a table for them to document their progress in it. But then this was their first chance to make a decision for themselves. So they were going to find an article or find a video. A lot of them go right to YouTube now that talks about how to be awesome in online learning. So those students went and had to do some selecting for themselves. And in that journal, they tracked their progress. So they copied and pasted the link and told me a little bit about the video they chose. Now I was talking about this a little earlier. Do becomes the place where the teacher has to step away. Okay. You might need to do mini lessons. You might find based on your diagnostic that 7 of your 23 kids need reteaching or new teaching on something, but the other 16 don't need it. But in a traditional classroom, you probably would have had all 23 kids sitting through the same lesson at the same time. But now we know the kids who already have that information, we have data that tells us these kids don't need it. They can move on. They can go do something else. They can practice the skill in a different way. So, and as you go, you might realize, or the student, as we get to co-constructed and learner-driven, will realize on their own, oh, I need to learn this. And they might go find a video on how to bake bread on their own, or they might ask the teacher to reteach something. And so the teacher, when you're doing your planning, you have to think about based on the diagnostic and my experience as a teacher, because the teacher still remains a super important figure here, even if you're more of a mentor, facilitator, coach than a direct instructor. Based on your experience, what kind of problems are kids going to face? What are they going to struggle with? And have resources and mini lessons ready to go for those kids when they need it. What we find works really well now is recording. If we record a mini lesson for 5 kids and another kid needs it, they can just go to the recording on their own. And sometimes they come and they just want you to tell them the answer. That's the other part that's really tough in the beginning. They're not used to this independence and they want to be told what to do. Just tell me what I need to write. Just tell me what I need to do. It's like, you have to tell me. I tell kids over and over now all the time, you tell me what grade you got, but show me the evidence and I'll let you know if I agree or not. You tell me, so that's as they go along, they more and more get comfortable with self-assessing, looking at their own evidence. But in the do phase, this is where the SEL really lives, the social emotional learning, for those who aren't using that term. And here's the different icons. So again, the wayfinding piece, the icons remain the same in every class so that the kids, that noise is removed. They know what it means when they see these symbols and they don't have to guess. And there's not a different version of it in every class. So that helps us build a kind of a larger culture around this. And now the reflection. Now this is a lot of discussion went around this. Should reflection come before feedback? Should it come during feedback? Well, the truth is reflection and feedback's happening all the time. But like a specific formal, I'm going to stop and do this reflection, it comes before they seek feedback. So there's 2 things they reflect on. Their goal. How am I doing? What progress am I making towards my goal? Or have I made towards my goal? And the actions I chose. So you might you might specifically be working with certain kids on executive function skills like note taking or time management. So they could build that into their goals, or you could know that that's something they're working on, and have them share evidence towards their progress or growth in that area as well. So just briefly, I mean, again, the presentation is available, and I don't want to take you through what most of you probably already know as strategies, but a really, really good one for me has been know and show. And it was reiterated with a lot of you probably been exposed to the distance learning playbook that Doug Fisher, Nancy Frey, and John Hattie wrote. But this is, it doesn't matter how old they are. I've done this with kids at different ages. Basically, you know, before they self-assess, before they ever come to feedback, they list the things they know now as a result of the goal they set, and they have to be able to provide evidence for to show that, right? Like, I can just say it. I can say I can dunk a basketball, but I can't even touch the rim when I try and jump, right? Okay, here's one with younger kids. So, you know, I know this looks like teacher writing on the one side. So this is what they're supposed to know. And on this side, they're showing it. They're showing it. And you can see the kid working through it. And there's some more examples here, a little more, you know, this one's around scientific explanation. This one is about US history. And so they write it right on there. And now this one's an example from one of my classes. The other thing I tell the students is, if you see the loop and you see the learning objective and you can already do it, don't waste your time. Don't go through a learning process just to go through it, just because we told you to. You stand up for yourself and show us evidence that you know it. So this is a student, we could work on the spelling a little bit, but it's not English class, right? We were doing a loop on grit. The unit was called Growth, Grit, and Gratitude, and they're gonna get ready for a larger leadership project in a future unit. So we want to make sure they have those traits and an understanding of them. So she's showing how she has used grit in the past, how she's used examples. She's giving me slides from things she created 2 years ago. This is a 7th grader. So she's confident, and she's had it on her mind for years, obviously, and she can share that evidence. She didn't have to do all the work in that. So that means now I have one student who's ready to go on to the next loop, and they're in different places, and we have to be comfortable with that, because they're in their place. They're where they need to be in their learning process. Here's another example of a tool where it's grow and show. So again, these are more simple ones. These are more elementary examples, but you put the learning objective or the criteria in the middle, and the student talks about, as they're self-assessing or reflecting, what they can still work on. And on the other side, you know, what they're really good at, what they're proud of, what they've learned. Another one, assessment with justification. So students going to say, self-assess and say why. And another one for reflection. This is one where the kids, eventually they just can write their own. But the scaffold, the reflection process, we give them prompts. So they can pick any two of these and start writing, get used to kind of writing out their thinking, their reflection. And over time, when we get to more co-constructed and learner-driven, they'll just bring us this. They can pick their own tool. They can create their own tool. They will show us evidence of reflection when they're seeking feedback or looking to be assessed. Okay, so now imagine how much time you save as a teacher if the student is coming to you with the learning criteria and the evidence of where they're at in their learning. I remember trying to grade essays for my social studies classes, you know, as a first, second year teacher, and I asked them to write these 5-page essays, and then I have to read them all and then give them a grade out of 100. And you might give one a grade, and then the next kid, it was about the same, but a little better. So that's the 87. The other one was the 86. And there's really, so now we're looking at, here's clear learning objectives. And here's a student who's in charge of providing the evidence that they can do this. I know it and I can do it. And if you agree, that's great. So, and early on, because it's going to be teacher heavy, but I often have them show it to their parents first and maybe record evidence of the meeting. Some of them just record the conversation with their parents, some of them, but it can be with peers, it can be with mentors. There's lots of places. You know, when you get to, especially kind of middle school, high school, you get to a point where they're learner driven. They might be in a company's R&D lab and they're getting feedback from an engineer. You know, that's the kind of thing we want to get to. So then we're talking about, you know, 4 kids on a field trip here, other kids here, maybe co-ops, but you know, we want to make sure that it's authentic as possible, right? So early on, it's just building the scaffolding, the structure as we move our kids through the continuum in our community. So now the teacher's showing me, these are the kind of questions, you know, I'm looking at their evidence. Why'd you do this? How'd you do this? And you want to put the onus on them to show their evidence. And if they can't answer the question, that tells you where they need to work on, right? And then again, so you can see the verbs the kids use. And now if they've got it, awesome. You know, you can authenticate their learning. What would you like to do next? And that brings us to our next phase. Or if they don't have it, they're realizing it based on their answers to your questions, and it's time to plan. So there's 3 options in plan. We can either re-engage. So I need to go back and do another one of the do activity options, right? So and then go through it again, reflect and seek feedback. I need to update my goal. It wasn't clear enough. Now, I'm at a point where I'm still working on releasing responsibility more and more with kids. You know, I've done this through 3 different groups now for full semester classes. And I like to just know that their goal is solid before they get going. You know, it's especially in middle school, they can be really frustrating for them if you let them go all the way through and their goal wasn't the right one and they realize it after. That's a lot to let go. So you know, that's one scaffold I do for middle school kids. I make sure that I see their goal before they make their decisions. Okay, and then engage in new learning. So that means I'm ready for the next loop. So I either re-engage in my current loop, or I'm ready for the next loop, or I'm ready to just go right to the assessment. And that happens more and more as they co-construct. I had students last semester that by the second unit, I was asking them to help design and select activities. So they were showing me they knew the standard by identifying how to teach it to their classmates. So that was my venture into co-constructed with them. And I had a few other students who seemed to be uninterested. You know, those kids who are uninterested in school. And they had the base skills. There were a few things we need to work on, but they just jumped right to the final assessment task. So you want to be flexible for the kids. But another thing I have to admit is it's almost easier in distance learning. When we're back in the building, when I have kids, 23 kids in 23 different places, where am I going to put them? They distract each other. So as a school, we have to talk about that. Can kids go to the library? Can they be in the hallways? We have lots of great hallway. I mean, if you've been on our campus, fantastic hallway furniture and common spaces and great places to work. It looks like a Google office sometimes, you know, those kind of campuses they have. But we're still, you know, either sometimes we let them go and we let them go too soon and too fast and they're just hanging out, or we just, you know, the bell hasn't rung yet, stay by the door. So we have to, you know, resolve that as a community and come to an understanding of what our learning environment looks like. And sometimes kids do just need a break to think. Okay, and then unit assessment, that's when we come back. Now, if your standards are your minimum, you've selected essential standards, and they're your minimum. As you're going through the loops, if the kids haven't met the learning objectives, they go back. So that means by the time you get to the unit assessment, they should be meeting the standards from their formative process, and they're ready to go beyond, right? So if we're really doing it and really keeping them to it, we don't move beyond the essential standards. Now, you might have not all schools use power standards, but so you pick the ones that are most important and that they can't move on without. Okay, and then we're more assessing to the enduring understandings. How do they answer the essential questions? How do they display evidence towards a larger enduring understanding? How do they transfer that learning to other contexts? How do they make it authentic to them? Right, so that's kind of another challenge we have, and it's starting to really bear fruit. And it's been fun to see in a lot of classes where kids are taking on projects that go above and beyond the standard of their own creation. And that's still just in the teacher-led, you know, and co-constructed. As we move towards more learner-led, I think we're going to see some really, really incredible things. Well, I know it. Okay, so again, if we look at this picture, we have our unit launch and the kids work their way through and up to the unit assessment. And these are the chunked pieces or learning objectives from the larger standards. Early on, you're likely to work on more knowledge stuff, the kind of information they need to proceed, I say. And then it becomes more applied as they go on before they're ready for the larger assessment. So there's different milestones they go through, or learning loops. Sometimes they repeat them. You know, sometimes people ask, how many times would a student have to do a learning loop? And we might say 3, for an example, because they do it on their own. Then you can handhold them as a teacher a little more. And if they still need more support, that's where you might bring in your learning support, special education teachers, whatever you call it, inclusion specialists to support that, because it's probably something beyond a tier 1. And we won't get into that too much here. That's not what the presentation is about. But so, you know, a teacher curates the loops so that they build on each other for success when they get to the performance task. I'll let you read that yourself. All right, so essentially we're just working our way through to higher levels of rigor until they're ready to go beyond what or at least meet the minimum expectation, which is the standard. And in some schools, especially where I've been, the standard is the highest grade. And for us, the standard is the minimum grade. Not yet, we're getting there, right? We got to shift our culture, but we want the essential standards we selected to be the minimum grade, and then allow them to explore beyond that. So that's everything I had to share. Thanks so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. It's fun to share, you know, our learning with other people. Great to see some of those familiar faces. I'd like to offer support or just an opportunity to continue the conversation with anybody who's interested. We have examples from all different subjects. So just write me, the email's there. And I'd be happy to share everything I have and continue the conversation within your context. So, well, there's 1 minute left. If there's anybody has questions, I'm sorry we started a little slower. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Just please unmute and let them rip.
Yeah, Jonathan, a quick question here. So looking at what you've said about scaffolding the loops and how, you know, there's a gradual progression in relationship with skills and whatnot. How much, you know, I think of, you know, Webb's depth of knowledge and well, particularly that one, and thinking about sort of that initial loop, maybe being certainly the introduction to a unit or a topic of study. Is that when you're looking at sort of that level 1 sort of recall ability to be able to progress into the next stages? Or, you know, what are you using? Are you not structuring it only on, you know, kind of Webb's DOK steps?
Well, I would say it depends on the prior knowledge of the students, right? So you might, in your unit launch, do some sort of diagnostic so you know what you have going in. So if it's a complicated concept or a new concept and you know it's new for all of them, you'll design those first steps very explicit and probably make them all decide to do them. But if you know that, I mean, we have kids jumping right to assessment tasks. We have kids jumping into further levels, but that's based on evidence of prior knowledge and skills. So
I mean, certainly pre-assessment does give the chance to know which loop a student needs to start at. Would you, you know, say that, you know, a student maybe start it on the second loop based upon where they're at in their pre-assessment?
Right. Yeah. Right. So they might start on a later loop, or after early ones jump right to the assessment. So it really depends on the loop design. So teachers really become designers here, and it takes practice. And another thing we do have to work on, I think a lot of schools do, you know, to just kind of reinforce and improve our PLC culture, our kind of evidence-based culture, so that we can be more familiar with what the students know and can do before we start, and have partner teachers have those conversations.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to another question, and I know that we're running short on time, but you know, there's always the devil's advocate, maybe, if you want to say, you know, with the person that says, well, how do you address discrepancy when you see a student performs fairly well on a pre-assessment, like showing that they know something, and then as you go through the process, you're seeing some sort of disconnect where it's like, but your pre-assessment showed that you knew this. So kind of how do you recuperate and say, you know what, how do you maybe have a conversation with that student to say, you know, hey, I might need you to knock down a level to get that knowledge that they're showing some discrepancy. How do you go about that?
Well, again, it's just looking at the learning data. So as people leave, thanks again for being here. I'll stay as long as anybody wants to. I don't have to race anywhere else, but you're looking at the learning data. So the students, the responsibility is the students to show evidence that they can. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, in one context I can, in another I can't. But mm-hmm. because you've deemed it essential, you need to know that they can transfer it mm-hmm. to all the different contexts. So it'd be exactly that conversation, but with the data in hand. And if the student can't show evidence, the challenge is, what can you do next? And you may need to help them select a new activity or direct them towards a different video or a different practice skill or mini lesson. But again, it's all got to be based on the evidence of their learning.
My last question, could you speak to maybe an example of what a learning activity would be? Because in one of the symbols it said attend. Can you talk about give an example for that?
Attend is just classes, this lesson at this time on this hour. Okay. So especially online, we have 90-minute windows, but we might only need them to attend the first 10 minutes, then they can go. And then those who need it will attend, so it's just that symbol of when to be there.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions or feedback, support, anything? Okay, well, thanks. Thumbs up are awesome. Thanks, Cancun. All right. Well, thanks so much for being here. The recording's there, but it was tip of iceberg. I'd really appreciate feedback through the form and any emails. I'll happily answer with as many examples as I can share.
Yeah.